The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's New Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentations by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Retired Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of AUSA's Noon Report webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and we really appreciate your partnership in the defense of our great nation. Joining us today for a very timely discussion on understanding Russia's grand strategy is Dr. Andrew Monaghan, who, among other things, is the director of the Russia Research Network. You'll hear a little bit more about his background in just a minute. And to moderate the discussion, we are pleased to welcome back the immediate past president of AUSA, General Retired Carter Ham. General Ham retired from the U.S. Army in June of 2013 after 37 years of service. His assignments included Director of Operations J3 on the Joint Staff, and his four-star assignments included Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe and later the Commander of U.S. Africa Command. After retirement from active duty, General Ham served as the chairman for the National Commission on the Future of the Army, which was tasked by Congress to make recommendations on the size, force structure, and capabilities of the total Army, regular Army, Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve. He most recently served as the president and CEO of AUSA from 2016 to October 2021. For those of you joining online today, please take advantage of having Dr. Monaghan and General Ham here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab in the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we'll take as many questions as time will allow. You can also find the full bios for Dr. Monaghan and General Ham at the Handouts tab. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to General Ham. And sir, thank you for taking time out of your important granddaddy duties to join us today.
Well, thanks very much, General Swan. Even though today is a sad and tragic day, it's a great honor and privilege for me to be back here. And I'm certainly honored to be alongside Dr. Andrew Monaghan, who you heard from General Swan is a very accomplished Russia expert. Since 2006, Dr. Monaghan has served as the director of the Russian Research Network. He's held positions at Oxford University, at the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, at King's College as well. He served in fellowships with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, the Royal United Services Institute, and the NATO Defense College. His articles and research have been widely published. His most recent book, republished in 2020, Dealing with the Russians, pretty timely, and his next book, his newest book, Russian Grand Strategy in an Era of Global Power Competition, will be released this spring. Dr. Monaghan, thanks for taking time while you're here in Washington, D.C. Tell us a little bit about what brought you here, particularly in this extraordinary time, and what's your focus of your studies while you're here in D.C.?
Well, General Ham, one and all, a sad day to be joining you, but thank you for the invitation to speak about these important issues. In fact, the reason why I'm here in Washington is to be a George Kennan Fellow is the result of what has been 2 to 3 years worth of planning, because originally I was due to be here in spring 2020 to work on a project on Russian ways of war. Obviously that was delayed by the pandemic, and it now turns out that here I am. I arrived in January, and the point really was to try to begin to use the project to try to begin to shift the conversation beyond what we were talking about in 2015, 16, 17 of Russia's measures short of war, to try and the grey zone and hybridity, towards thinking much more about Russian measures of war How does the Russian Federation go to war? What does war mean to the Russian military? What is the purpose of war? And to try and trace something of trajectory through Russian military history to contemporary times, and to look into the future for what that means. So today is sadly the part of what was encompassed in the original project.
Well, I think we're all saddened by the recent events in and around Ukraine, and we'll certainly get to that as an important topic in our conversation today. But Ukraine is kind of one piece, I think, of Russia's grand strategy, and you've given a lot of thought and done a lot of study and research on Russia's grand strategy. And while it's an extraordinarily complex topic, can you give us kind of a synopsis of what is Russia's grand strategy? What is it that they're trying to achieve in this current era?
Sure, yes, as you say, a large subject, and one I think that we want to draw in two slightly separate questions. The first is something that we see and we discuss a lot these days, of the wide range of policy disputes that the Euro-Atlantic community has with Moscow. These have gone now for many years. We can take it back to Kosovo, we can take it back to the early 2000s. But we can talk then about NATO enlargement and the European security architecture. We can talk about Crimea. These are the points that usually feature in our discussion of Russian thinking and how we work, how we consider policy towards Russia. But actually I'd like to take you back the same sort of time frame to the mid-2000s, because that's when you begin to see the rebirth of Russian grand strategy. The attempt by the Russian leadership to overhaul its planning documentation, to think ahead initially to 2020, to try to shape an architecture, policy architecture, and rebuild the landscape of defense, economics, and politics in Russia. What you see is the result, therefore, of about 20 years' worth of power. And if we take power creation, if we take strategy as the attempt to formulate plans on the one hand, but then actually implement them on the other, so strategy is the generation of power, what we see is the difficult process, that is, the difficult but persistent process that the Russian leadership has sought to implement. The ability to reform, re-equip and rehearse military capabilities, but also reshape the economy, rebuild diplomatic capabilities. So all of the different levers of state that we see in action today, this is the rebuilding of that. I would also broaden this out so that we understand why the Russian leadership has attempted to do this. What we see first is an understanding in Russia in the 2000s that the state had numerous difficulties in creating power, and therefore an attempt to try to address this, to look at a changing world and to create a certain stability in the state so that it could navigate what it began to see as an increasingly competitive international environment. So Russian assessments looking ahead from the mid-2000s onwards were that the international environment was going to become much less stable. Conflict was going to intensify, particularly competition over resources, access to transit routes, access to markets, and this was the environment they decided they have to be able to compete in. So Russian grand strategy is an attempt to create a stable ship of state that can sail through choppy waters.
So it seems, as you discussed, in the early 2000s, that focus on a longer term and development of grand strategy also seems concurrent with Mr. Putin's rise to power. Is he the driver of this, or are there many other factors?
There are many other factors to this, because if we think of some of our history and our old strategists and how we understand strategy, the problem with strategy is always other people, both those on your own side and those competitors. So it is really a collective Russian leadership, a collective Putin, so to speak, a group of people that formed in the early 90s, sometimes even before that. So a long-term leadership that then became more and more senior into the late 1990s. And when Putin took over first the prime ministership and then the presidency in 2000, there was already an initial group of people there. And that group has grown through the 2000s as they began to appoint people. So really, yes, Mr. Putin is a central figure in this. But what we're really also looking at is a collective around him, a group around the leadership.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we do, particularly we Americans, have a tendency, I think, to focus on Mr. Putin personally, and it's larger than that. I think that's your message.
And really, also, we're looking at a chain of command here, so that strategy, of course, is the ability to formulate plans, but then have them implemented. And this is why we see the difficulties that Russian leadership has often faced over the last 20 years, where orders have been tardily or not at all implemented. So real problems in generating power through the chain of command. We've seen that in the military over the last few years, but also in other sections in energy and elsewhere.
As you raised the subject of the military component of grand strategy is obviously quite important, and we've seen that at work in many different instances over the past 20 years with Russia. But given our audience, this is the Association of the United States
Yes.
Army, a military-focused audience. Talk a bit, if you would, about the military component of Russia's grand strategy.
So I think this bit is particularly interesting, because we in the UK, in NATO, and in the US, I think we rather decided with the annexation of Crimea, and we rather decided that the Russian military leadership had come to a new conclusion about war, that they would fight measures short of war, that these were conclusions that they would continue to implement. In fact,
the gray zone.
The grey zone,
Sorry, yeah.
all of the different names that we've come up with it to blur our own understanding, while we don't tend to look at some of the other measures. In fact, the Russian military leadership has continued to discuss what the changing character of war is throughout. And what's particularly important is that since 2019, as a result of this debate, they've started to rediscuss and reshape Russian military strategy, which is to understand the theory of war and how the military can contribute to the security and defense of the state. So you see a much more substantive discussion about different kinds of war fighting. Is the one-blow war, one-blow, knockout blow strategy of destruction the way to go, or is it much more the question of strategy of attrition? Can we, as thinking as the Russian military leadership was doing, can we point to wars in the past which have been successfully decisive? As we're familiar with that decisive war question, or do they always really draw out into this attritional? So you see lots of reference to the 20th century, to the Second World War, which is the real point of focus for many of them. And then you start to see different strategies emerge from this. A concern about the United States military capability, certainly. The concern in Russia that the US is able to deliver power across the globe, to knock out an adversary with one blow.
You've spoken before about Russia's focus on Desert Storm, Desert Shield as an example of that.
That's exactly right. So in many ways, instead of looking at Crimea in some sense, we should be looking at how the Russians understood 1991 and Desert Storm, which the Russians saw as an example of a successful, decisive use of force to achieve a policy end. Of course, it's not like for like, but this is what the Russians might call sixth-generation warfare, the ability to strike from a distance. And this is the kind of situation now that we find ourselves in, I think, where the Russian military has drawn these conclusions about how do you fight a successful war. And you see the Russian Gerasimov, Chief of General Staff, talking about active defense, or strategies of limited operations, and strategies of territorial defense. So a lot of thought has gone into Russian military strategy over the last 3 to 5 years.
Oversimplifying, strategy is often referred to as ends, ways, and means. The means that we are seeing in the Russian military today are different than what we perhaps thought they would be 20 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about the investments that Russia has made in developing the capabilities to implement their military strategy?
Two sets of investments I think that we want to take note of. First is the ability to create a capable armed force after the Russo-Georgian War, where a number of flaws were clear. The attempt to modernize significantly the conventional armed forces.
This is following the invasion of Georgia in 2008.
In 2008, that's right. Where you have a conventional deployment, of course, but a flawed conventional deployment. And then you see the military try to reform off that to re-equip, and first aiming at 70% new weapons, and then more from there. And again, this is a little bit about where we see the procurement list. So, even in 2010, the Russian leadership talking about acquiring 2,000 new tanks, 2,300 pieces of self-propelled artillery, and so on and so forth. Very much a firepower, an understanding of the use of firepower.
May not need 2,000 tanks for gray zone conflict.
That's exactly right, General. That's precisely it. This question of firepower has remained at the heart of Russian military thinking, about the heart of the writing since then. But I would say it's not just the resources, the extensive resources that have been the money that has been spent on this. It's also about the effort to rehearse this capability. And therefore you see the reshaping of the Russian defense landscape, the introduction of the National Defense Management Center, the reorganization of aerospace and air forces and air defense into the aerospace forces, and then the extensive exercising, the numerous SNAP tests that we would see, the large-scale exercises that they run every year, where you see really the question is command and control and logistics, about moving large groups up and down across the country and being able to regroup and redeploy capabilities. So extensive rehearsal as well as re-equipment.
And again, we'll get to Ukraine in a few minutes, but what you describe is what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, right?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
just that. So let me ask you to address a position that has been advanced by some that says Russia is a power in decline, a struggling economy. Some would say, that Russia's, in a disparaging way, Russia's economy is smaller than that of Italy. In other ways that say, it's a single source economy based almost exclusively on oil, and so Russia's on the way down. How would you answer those who postulate that?
Well, this is a view that's widespread both in London and I think in the US. I quite often hear this. It's interesting, the basis of this argument, because it tends to posit that Russia is that because of a bleak socio-economic outlook, there is inevitable change. Now, we've heard that kind of logic elsewhere. It's ironic that kind of socio-economic inevitability of socio-economic change happens to be done in London and Washington these days. But the grounding is slightly, I think, is unsure here. We point at Russian demographic decline, for instance, and two things emerge from that. First is that the population is likely only really to start declining from the late 2030s into the 2040s. And actually what you're looking at is a slightly aging population, but again, only from the late 2030s. The economy, as you said, well, there are those who point to an economy that is roughly the equivalent of Italy or Spain or a number of others. That's in one way right, but it's not right in another way, which is to see GDP through purchasing power parity, which gives the Russians, and forgive the phrase today, but it's clear, much bigger bang for their buck. That the expenditure goes further. So the Russian economy isn't the size of Italy or Spain. It's actually, on these terms, rather larger. It's about the sixth largest in the world and approaching the largest in Europe. So this is not the right grounding to be looking at Russian futures. And I would simply say, as a result of this, we've tended to focus on optimistic outlook for our scenarios. Almost all of our scenarios, US and UK, come 2030, come 2040, is that Russia has either been forced through socio-economic change to seek reconciliation with us, or has disappeared from the international environment. We are mainstreaming black swan events, the highly unpredictable, highly unlikely events, and we're ignoring what I think are known in future and foresight thinking as grey rhino events, which are the unhappy, big, slow-moving ones that we can see coming towards us that we would prefer to ignore.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and we Americans, I think, often accused of mirror imaging, and that can be dangerous when your competitor, your adversary in this case, isn't a mirror image.
Mirror imaging, and unfortunately wishing a problem away to an extent. We hope for the best in many ways, that Russia would become would become democratic, would become a partner, would essentially join the Euro-Atlantic community. We've held that idea in many ways for most of the post-Cold War era, despite the very obvious dissonance, policy dissonance since 2007, since 2012, since 2014, and obviously today.
Yeah, I think I certainly remember, and I know many of the members of our audience remember that the immediate post-Cold War era. We saw programs such as Partnership for Peace. We saw the NATO-Russia dialogue. All those things promised a different future, but yes, it didn't. Obviously, did not come to be. Let me ask you one more question before we turn to the immediate circumstance in Ukraine, and that's about China. We in the U.S. military, we kind of view China as, some would say, the pacing threat. Mm-hmm. We saw just a few weeks ago in the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in Beijing, President Putin, President Xi, established made the statement there are no limits, their words, no limits to the cooperation between the two nations. So what do you think that means? And let me just ask you directly, in the current circumstance, do you believe that Russia would have undertaken the military action that they have undertaken without at least the tacit support or the consent of China?
I have to be a little bit cautious about this because I'm a Russianist, not a Sinologist on the one hand. But I think I would draw your attention to two parts here. The first is that the Russian relationship with China has been growing since the early to mid 2000s. In fact, I would even tie it back to that point I was making about strategy on the one hand and the desire to build certain international partnerships from the mid 2000s. That idea that was growing also again in the mid 2000s, that the Russians saw by 2020 there would be growing geoeconomic and geopolitical competition. So a very deliberate attempt to create a relationship with China. An understandable one given the length of the Russo-Chinese border. And of course the very difficult relationship that Moscow has had, or the Soviet Union had with communist China. So a number of reasons why the Russian leadership wanted to set this up. And again, that longer term structure here helps to contextualize the answer to your question, which is that we've seen growing economic relations with them, between Russia and China. We've seen growing military coordination. Just to choose the obvious examples of weapons sales on the one hand, but also coordination in exercises, not just in the what the Russians and the Chinese still call the Asia-Pacific region, that we would call Indo-Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean, even closer to the NATO environment. So you see a relationship that's been growing and tightening, I think, for a number of years now. And what you see is a deliberate effort to develop this. So Russia is selling more and more strategically important goods to the Chinese, where hydrocarbons, but also in weapons, as I say, but also I think we'll see much more also of grain and other supplies, nuclear energy. So you see this is the point about building that relationship, and that's forecast and planned to increase well into the 2030s. So the answer is yes. No, I mean, from our point of view today, no limits is a good way of putting it, because it's scheduled and planned to increase ever further. Would the Russians have gone if the Chinese had said no? I think that's a dilemma question, because the Russians have a very serious set of policy disagreements with us that may in the end have overridden that. But I think that to have built the relationship with China and to have tried to create the relationship whereby the Chinese have also published a statement saying they disagree with NATO enlargement, or expansion as they called it, that gives you the answer to the question, which is they had agreed to this.
Yeah, it's also, to me, very interesting that, of course, Ukraine is envisioned to be part of the Belt and Road concept. So that's an interesting challenge. So let's turn now and talk a bit about Ukraine, and then we'll get to the audience questions in just a moment. So let me ask you the overarching question, which is, what is it that Russia is trying to achieve in Ukraine? Is it support for the so-called separatist areas in Luhansk and in the eastern part of Ukraine? Is it about NATO expansion? Is it about a buffer? What in your understanding? What's the driver between the military action that we've seen Russia undertake?
It probably sounds cheating, but I think I would like to say all three of those. And these are three important questions that are all bound up together. And what you're seeing is a deliberate attempt to try to shape and force diplomacy over the last 2 to 3 years. And then what you're starting to see now is the recognition over the last year or so that the Russians did not see negotiation with Kiev as being fruitful, therefore wanted to start to oblige Kiev to implement Minsk II. Also the growing relationship between the United States and Ukraine, UK and Ukraine, which has been very visible over the last 2 to 3 years. This is that concern where Moscow has flipped the argument to say that it's no longer, as people are aware, because I'm sure following, it's no longer about Ukraine in NATO, it's about NATO in Ukraine. So we are looking at 2 or 3 sets of questions here that are built in. There is the immediate question of Ukraine's position within the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, undoubtedly. But there is also that broader picture about Russia's competition, growing competition with the Euro-Atlantic community. And that for me is why this is such a strategic set of questions, because it's not only about the tragedy of the war that's unfolding, it's also about other things that will relate to this, such as energy competition. We've seen Nord Stream 2, for instance, be shelved, and then we will start to get, as we already see, signals from the Russian leadership talk about energy competition. So it's bound. There are 2 or 3 things that are bound together here, which are very difficult to separate. And I'm sure that some of the audience will prioritize one over the other. I find them almost inseparable between Minsk II, NATO enlargement, and broader competition.
Yeah, it's certainly a complex set. So one more question, then we'll turn to our audience. And again, use the Q&A tab to pose your question, and we've got several in already. We look forward to those. But Dr. Monaghan, look in your crystal ball,
yes.
All right, and don't look out to June. Look out to next week, all right. And militarily, what do you envision the situation in Ukraine will look like in about a week?
Okay, to give myself time to think about that, I'm going to say that one of the things I would encourage everyone to be doing now is to be shaping a view of the future that is not just about tomorrow or the next week,
yeah.
but please do, particularly in the military and in political spheres, please be looking at what's happening in June, in December, then in 2025 and 2027. This is a foundational event for European politics and security. So it's imperative that we don't go from day to day. I promise to come to the answer, but I think it's an essential point to make that we keep the eyes up to look at the strategic picture as well. The second part to the question will be, well, if the Russian military are able to achieve what they want to do, which is win a war in the initial period of war, that decisive week to 2 weeks, you'll see you would see a decisive victory within that period. You would see the defeat and I use the terms that the Russian leadership has stated, the demilitarization of Ukraine. That was, right. I quote President Putin, which essentially means the defeat of its armed forces, or either the surrender or defeat in battle of its armed forces, particularly of those forces who have been supported and sustained by the Euro-Atlantic community. And again, I make sure and make explicit that this is President Putin's line from last night, the denazification of Ukrainian politics, which I interpret to mean a change in leadership.
Right. Displace the current government.
Displace the current government. So this is the use of war as a tool of politics and policy and power.
Very Clausewitzian.
For an audience such as this, if we want to understand it, we go back to our Clausewitz, and of course, but then the difficulty to that is we understand 2 things: fog and friction. And the Russians understand this as well as anyone. The Russian military understands this as well as anyone. So what we're looking at really is an attempt by the Russians to win within the initial period of war. And
so pulling on that string, several questions from the audience. I suppose I think I know how you would answer this, but questions, do you think that Russia will employ tactical nuclear weapons in this military, in this war as it is begun?
I think not at the moment. I think what you're looking at is the use of conventional armed forces to achieve decisive political results. I think that use of nuclear any kind of nuclear weapons changes the dynamic fundamentally.
That's a threshold.
That's a different threshold that would then start to draw in that would broaden the range of the war, which I think that the Russian military leadership in military strategy terms has invested a lot of effort into working out how to use the military tool to win at the conventional level, so beneath the nuclear threshold. And I think that again, bearing in mind we're talking about war, the attempt to win without nuclear war as quickly as possible, without nuclear threshold as quickly as possible, is most likely.
Good, thank you. We certainly all hope and pray that is the case. The current war is dangerous enough.
Yes.
This would take it to a whole different level.
Yes.
So Ukraine's a large country with a large population. Even if Russia is able to achieve its objectives, there's likely to be an insurgency remaining inside Ukraine. And a question from Bill W. So how well prepared is the Russian military to deal with an insurgency in Ukraine? Even if their initial military objectives are successful, and so far the defense officials in Russia have said they have achieved all of their day one objectives, but if you're there for a long time, an insurgency is bound to develop.
I think this is an important question, and I don't mean this to sound like I'm arguing against it. I flinch slightly at the sense of an inevitable guerrilla war or partisan war. We assume that partisans would immediately emerge and that it could be a force, but it's not quite as easy to do as all that. So I think it's certainly a possibility, but then one has to say, well, where does this insurgency break out? Is it in the west of the country? It's more likely, it seems perhaps to me, to be in the west of the country than in the east of the country. And if the Russian leadership isn't looking to control that part, that's not the same as if it was in the east. In the east, it seems to me an effort to shift that to a Russian political situation as quickly as possible, or a separatist political position as possible. I think it's not as easy. It's not as easy just to mount a partisan war as people would like to think. I think yes, it would be very messy, very bloody, and very unpleasant. But I think there are some Russian capabilities that have been Rosgvardia, perhaps, that might be used to try to prevent that from breaking out.
Yeah,
so, I mean, for those who are interested in our military history, it's worth bearing in mind that first the Soviets and now took the wars of the middle of the 19th century as being the exemplars of how you win this. So 1870, for those of you who think about this in these military historical terms, where the Prussians defeated the French very quickly, but then had to face the franc-tireur, for instance, is perhaps one of the things that the Russian leadership has already been thinking about how to cope.
So it kind of hints to me that there's at least some significant thought on the part of the Russians about a concern of overreaching.
I would think so. Again, we have to hypothesize a little bit in terms of where we understand what's visible, and also the traditions of the Russian military, which has often been quite cautious in the anticipation of it, or in the implementation of its political objectives, or cautious in the delivery of it. And I think that you do see two features which must have caused some Russian military planners some doubt: the large scale of Ukraine, the size of it,
That's right.
Of course, which complicates defense as well. That's the counter-argument. But also the large population and the large defense industry. So there can be quite quickly a lot of weapons floating around in Ukraine. So all of these things, I'm sure, have been thought through by the Russian military. Whether they have come up with adequate means of countering them or not, I don't know. We'll have to see. But that's part of fog and friction that we were talking about.
An interesting question from Ronald. We've seen in Ukraine the call up of reserve forces and mobilization of reserve forces. Has Russia done the same in preparation? Have they mobilized their reserve forces?
There has been some call on preparation. I mean, we see that partly the scale of the Russian armed forces has been due to mobilization preparation. Yes, and there are some stories about how this is being done now. I think really we should be looking much more at contract and combat readiness forces, though. That's the primary point of where we're looking.
And does the call up of Russian reserves, how does that affect Russian popular support? Obviously, that's a big deal here in the United States when the National Guard or reserve forces are mobilized for federal duty. That has a significant impact. How so in Russia?
I think what you'd be examining here is the question of what these mobilized forces are to achieve. And I mean, the Russians have a lot of negative experience of occupying states with conscripts, even in the Chechen wars, where you had actually mobilization of conscripts and heavy casualties, which in fact led to the Russian leadership having to seek a peace treaty in the mid-1990s. So my thinking along these lines would be that the Russian leadership would try to use military leadership would try to use contract combat-ready forces for the actual combat.
We shift your focus up north a bit. We've seen, some would call it the Russian playbook, essentially the same principles in Georgia, Donbass, Crimea in 2014, now in Ukraine in 2022. Do you see what's the likelihood, how do you assess the likelihood of a similar, again, playbook action in the Baltic states? Of course, that's a different measure. Those are now NATO members.
Yes, and I think we must be very, very clear here that this is a different level of question. However difficult it is when we have between the UK and Ukraine and between the US and Ukraine in many ways very friendly relations. The Baltic states are NATO allies, and they have been well supported and trained and prepared and equipped and have prepared themselves also for this. There's not the same set of policy disputes as there was between, and there is between Moscow and Kiev. So I do draw the distinction. I still would like to try to keep us focused on this almost Clausewitzian sense of war as the result of policy clashes. That helps, I think, to explain quite a lot. And it helps us also to understand the picture of what would happen, for instance, in the Baltic states. If there is war in the Baltic states, it's because there's a wider different policy dispute between Brussels and Moscow. So it's not just the Baltic states. It would actually involve much bigger picture with NATO.
A number of questions from our audience about next steps, not for Russia, but for the West. What are the actions that you think, with your understanding of Russia, what are the actions that the U.S., the U.K., and others might take that would have a desired effect to limit Russia's further military action, to bring a halt to the war?
To bring a halt to the war, I think that bringing a halt to the war will be, the way the war will be brought to a halt is by Moscow achieving what it considers to be its political objectives. It's going to be very difficult, I think, externally to impose measures that such as sanctions that would cause the Russian leadership to stop its war. These are mismatched capabilities. I think that when we look at what's going through today, I saw before I came on that Prime Minister Johnson had spoken to Parliament and emphasised a series of quite harsh sanctions, much harder than the first round. I believe that President Biden is speaking either earlier this afternoon or about now. So sanctions and diplomacy are the ways that we're going to have to use in this particular instance. I would be very clear, though, about adding to this that it's essential that Washington, London, and Brussels start to think very strategically about Russia. I start to see it as a global player, not just a regional one. Start to see it as a power that might indeed increase its resource and capability through the 2020s. and start to be actually a power and shaper of international affairs. Because at the moment we go from crisis to crisis, and that's not how you do deterrence. Deterrence is a longer-term plan about as part of a coherent strategy. And I know there are friends and happy acquaintances both in Washington and in London who will say we do have a Russia strategy. I don't really like quoting Churchill, and it's probably apocryphal anyway. But however beautiful the strategy, sometimes you have to look at the results.
Yeah.
And I think that actually we're not looking sufficient. Come back to your earlier question. We've talked about Russia as a power in decline now for so long without strategy. We see both of these as being not true. I'm sorry to sound as though it's theoretical or policy wonkish, but we can't go anywhere without diagnosing the nature of the problem first. So strategy and foresight are going to remain at the heart of this. And then you can start to implement other restrictive, and again we go back since I'm the Kennan Fellow. Start to think, just remember George Kennan's points, not to say that we're back in 1946, we're not, and I'll mention Frank Roberts since he was the British chargé at the same time in Moscow with George Kennan. Both of these were these individuals trying to shape longer term ideas about how one would deal with this on a global scale. And that for me must be the starting point. And in the meantime, sanctions diplomacy, and diplomacy must include not just going to Kiev, but going to Moscow. It must include also going to China, to India, and other major powers.
Well, and that's been, as you bring up George Kennan and others, so that there's been some criticism that since the end of the Cold War, essentially the end of containment was the last grand strategy that the U.S. had, and maybe time for a revisitation on our side.
I'll leave you to make observations about the U.S. side. I would certainly welcome that from London. London has tried to do this in some sense, and I know that there are colleagues here in the U.S. who want to do the same. London has this integrated review, which is both an attempt at strategy and we want to think in those strategic terms, but it's going to require, I think, further emphasis.
So two related questions from the audience I think are really interesting, from Bruce T. and Mary F. So Bruce's question is, do the Russian people support this action? And if so, how long? And Mary's question of how long can Russian forces persist in this? This is a pretty costly endeavor that Russia has embarked on. How long can they sustain that?
Well, let's start with the population question, the popular support question. Watching some Russian newsreels when Putin acknowledged, recognized the two republics, so to speak, vox pops on the street were very much, the majority were, yeah, we should recognize this. I think we need to be quite careful about talking, which I'm not saying that the questioner is saying this, but we should be quite careful about assuming that the Russian population necessarily disagrees with a lot of what's going on. We would have to see how that changes through an extended war of heavy casualties, of civilian casualties, and so on. But if the war is blitzkrieg successful, and it ends quite quickly with, as we know, blitzkrieg is intended in many ways to win the war with minimum cost.
Compared to the Soviet experience and our own experience in Afghanistan,
which is a very different thing, which went on for many years. So we'll see how the next 2 weeks wrap up. But at the moment, we shouldn't assume. I think that the population. There have been very small-scale protests in Russia, and we must observe the size, not only the size, but the fact that those small protesters have been arrested.
Good. Well, thanks for that. One last question, and thanks to the audience so much for a great series of questions. For the questions that we weren't able to get to, we'll make sure that Dr. Monaghan gets those and has an idea of what you're thinking. I think it will help him in his studies. So I'm going to turn to the last question. and hopefully make you a bit uncomfortable and take you more into the perhaps the political world. It's a question from Richard H. How influential are the international organs, the United Nations, the European Union, the others? I mean, we're seeing wide condemnation of Russia's actions from nearly every country across the globe. Obviously, not those that are more closely aligned with Russia. Does that matter? Does that carry any influence, or will that in any way modify Russia's behavior?
It's a sad question, because I'm afraid it's not a question that discomforts me. I'm afraid that my answer might discomfort you and sadly the audience. Is that I remind you about the incidents such as Sergei Skripal in the UK, the condemnation that came after that. This is when the Russian leadership wants to achieve what it sees as an essential political goal or an essential task, it will do it. And condemnation alone from London or from Washington or from any other Western or Euro-Atlantic or allied state is, I'm afraid, unlikely to shift that. It's working on a different set of principles. Policy, the clash of policy, the resolution of the policy dispute, I'm afraid, is the point of victory. That's what we must be looking at, the military tool to achieve that, and the argument that the Russian leadership could be shamed into withdrawing or shamed into some such situation, I'm afraid, is not, how can I put this, is not supported by historical examples.
Well, thanks, Dr. Monaghan. Thanks for your insights, bringing your experience to bear for us and the audience on this very sad day. It obviously is a tense time, a tragic time. This has global impacts, but we should not forget that the hardest blows fall on the Ukrainian people.
That's right.
As seems always the case in war, it is the innocents who pay the highest price. So in addition to all that Dr. Monaghan has spoken of, there's an underlying humanitarian crisis that is going to emerge quite quickly that will have a significant effect.
That's right.
So thank you, sir. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the honour of joining you today and in conversation with your colleagues. It's an honour to be in conversation with you.
Well, thanks very much, and for our audience, again, thanks so much for joining us. I encourage you to read more of Dr. Monaghan's works, which you can find online, and to read his forthcoming book, which will be released this spring, Russian Grand Strategy in an Era of Global Power Competition. And General Swan, thanks again to you and the entire AUSA team for hosting Dr. Monaghan and putting this program together, sadly in a very timely event, but important for us to have these tough discussions. Thanks, General Swan.
Thank you, General Swan.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for a fascinating discussion and helping us put the tactical events that we're watching on television into a broader strategic understanding of what's going on in Europe and in Russia. So thank you for those comments today. Before we depart this afternoon, I want to inform everyone about some upcoming AUSA events. On March 1st, we'll host another AUSA Noon Report on the recently released Army Climate Strategy with Mr. Paul Farnan, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy, and Environment, and that'll be sponsored by our friends at Guidehouse. On the 8th of March, we'll host the AUSA Coffee Series featuring our guest speaker, Army Chief of Staff General James McConville, at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir. That'll be sponsored by our friends at BAE Systems. And then on 20 April, we'll host yet another noon report on Army Central, the Army component headquarters of U.S. Central Command, featuring the commanding general of ARCENT, Lieutenant General Ronald Clark. These are just some of the great events and speakers that we have scheduled in the coming weeks, and I hope you can join us for one or more of these wonderful events. For more information about any of these or other activities at AUSA or to register for any of these events, please visit our website at ausa.org. And finally, we want to thank all of you who support us with your membership. Membership matters. We simply can't accomplish AUSA's mission to educate, inform, and connect America's Army to many different audiences without your help. So please, if you want to check on your membership or join AUSA, go to ausa.org. And once again, gentlemen, thank you for your comments today. And everyone out there, have a great Army Day.